So the Christians at Galatia had a problem. They could be compared to charismatics. But in their thinking, they went right when God went left. And they went back under the law because they were duped by the Judaizers. And so Paul writes, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and one by the free woman. But the son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh." Now think about this. Abraham had two sons. He took two women. But one woman was a slave woman, and the other woman was a free woman. And Paul is referring to Hagar, the Egyptian slave woman, and Sarah, Abraham's wife. And so Paul writes, "But the son of the bondwoman," that's Ishmael, "was born according to the flesh." That means Ishmael was born according to the natural biological process of procreation. And the son of the free woman through promise. Isaac was not born in the natural manner. He was born on account of God's promise because Sarah had been barren, one. And two, Sarah had already become very old. So between barrenness and old age, Isaac was not born because of any natural process. He was born because God's promise fixed the problem. God's promise brought it through, brought it to pass. And so these two sons were born in very different manners. One according to the natural process of procreation, and the other essentially was born simply because God said so. In spite of nature, in spite of Sarah's barrenness, in spite of her old age. And so Paul writes, this is allegorically speaking. In other words, this is about a story. And this story reveals the truth. Now, these men had already died. These men were already gone. In other words, in one sense we could say, that's past history. Yeah, it's past history. The lives of Ishmael and Isaac, yeah, it's past history. But the spiritual truth revealed is not past history. And it wasn't just the history of Paul's day. The spiritual truth revealed is eternal. It's supra-history. It's beyond history. Why? It's eternal in nature. So we can see here that the apostle understood that God was speaking. God is speaking spiritually, not in a way that causes the earth to shake. Oh no. He's speaking in a very hidden way through a very simple story, but with the purpose of revealing spiritual truth. And so, Paul writes, for these women, that's Hagar and Sarah, these women are two covenants. Now, if you want to keep life simple, I think it's best that we adopt the apostles' view and we look at this book in the terms of two covenants. And those two covenants are the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. That was primarily what the apostles, and in this case the Apostle Paul, were concerned about. they recognized two covenants, and to some degree, they saw somewhat of a reflection between one and the other. And if you understand this, it actually makes it much easier to put the whole Bible into perspective. And so Paul, he writes, he says, "For these women are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves, and she is Hagar." Okay, what came at Mount Sinai? Well, what came was what we know of as the Old Covenant, or the Mosaic Covenant. The covenant that God gave through Moses to the people of Israel, when really they became a nation or a group of people with a national identity. As Abraham's descendants who had come out of Egypt, they, we could say, met God at Mount Sinai, or God, he divinely manifested his presence, and he instituted the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant, the covenant based on the blood of an animal, or animal sacrifice, and they became a people. And so Paul, he compares that. Well, he says, "Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." In other words, Paul is comparing the Old Covenant, or the Mosaic Covenant, really the foundation of the biblical Judaism. He's comparing that to Hagar, the Egyptian slave woman. And he says so. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. Now what does Paul mean when he says the present Jerusalem? Well, in Paul's day, the present Jerusalem was the Jerusalem that was authoring the attacks against the apostles and against the church. Remember, before Paul's own conversion, he had been commissioned to go all the way to Damascus in Syria. For what? To persecute Christians. The present Jerusalem was the author of the persecution inside Israel, and to some degree even outside of Israel, against those who believed in and followed Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. So Paul writes, "Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. For she is in slavery with her children." Now, if you remember back to the Gospels, Jesus said to the Jewish leaders, the Jewish leaders actually said, "We are Abraham's descendants, and we have never been enslaved to anyone. We have never been in bondage to anyone." And Jesus said, "He who commits sin is a slave to sin." So, yeah, these people were people of the Old Covenant. They were people, they were God's people through the Old Covenant. But ultimately, they were slaves of sin. So Paul writes, "Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai." What does Sinai actually mean in the the Aramaic language? Sinai means hate. Hate. Now this Hagar is Mount Hate in Arabia, and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, or the present city of peace. For she is in slavery, they're slaves of sin, with her children. In other words, the Old Covenant did not produce liberty. The Old Covenant did not produce freedom. The Old Covenant produced people who actually became more sinful. And this was seen all through the history of Israel, as Israel turned away from God, persecuted the prophets. And ultimately, when God said, I'll send my son, they said, let's take him and kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So, Paul is likening Hagar to the Old Covenant and to the present Jerusalem, which Paul says was in slavery with her children. And Paul goes on to write, but the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. This means that in the mind of the apostle and in God's mind, with regard to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, this means that there was actually two Jerusalems. There was the Jerusalem at the present time when Paul wrote, which Paul said was in slavery with her children. And there was the Jerusalem from above, which is free. Not a slave, which is free. And Paul says, for she is our mother. Who is our? Who's the our Paul's speaking of? The our mother, the us, is the church. So Paul, he sees, he discerns, he understands. First, there was two women, Hagar and Sarah. Then, there was two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. And so, there are two covenants. The Old Covenant, which was based on the blood of animals and the Ten Commandments, and the New Covenant, which is based on the blood of Christ and the commandment of love. And there are two groups of children. The Old Covenant unbelieving Jews, and the New Covenant people of faith in Christ.